Welcome back to Mr. Orr's Flipped Classroom for Grammar. Grammar Lab 8 is about adjectives, adverbs, and telling the difference. As usual in your notes, you'll find a link to the slides themselves that you're going to see in the screencast, as well as, of course, the link to the notes screencast that you're watching now. As you follow along with the screencast, please go ahead and fill in the blanks on the notes page as you do, and make sure, of course, that as you do that, you're trying to understand, not just trying to get those blanks filled in. So work for understanding, not just completion. On our next day, we'll go ahead and do the practice together, but that will be our next screencast. All right, let's begin with the slides. All right, first, our definitions. Modifiers. Modifiers is a larger group of words. These are words that give information about or modify meaning change, the meanings of other words. Usually modify means to add to it in the case of a part of speech. We use the term modifier because there are two main types: adjectives, modifier add details to nouns and pronouns, and adverbs, which modify or add details to verbs, adjectives, and other adverbs. So as you see, part of the reason why we're so confused by what's the difference between an adjective and adverb is not just the first two letters are the same. It's because they actually serve a very similar purpose in a sentence. They do similar things. When you combine that similarity with the similarities of how those words are spelled, or at least how they begin to be spelled, it starts to make sense why these are so confusing. Also, what makes adjectives and adverbs more problematic to understand is that it assumes or expects that you understand nouns, pronouns, verbs, as well as adjectives and adverbs to make sense of these. That's a lot of layers of understanding, and not everyone has all of those or feels confident about those, which all feeds back to our uncertainty about adjectives and adverbs. First, we're going to back that up to a more general sense as we look at these notes and prepare you to understand these more deeply and use them in your language more intentionally. So let's look at some different types of adjectives. Again, adjectives are going to modify and describe or add detail to nouns or pronouns. So the most general kind of adjective is called a descriptor. No, don't worry about being quizzed on these. I just want to break these down into different types so you understand how these work. So descriptors are what kind, which one, or how many. When we think about how many, that means oftentimes numbers can be a descriptive adjective. Many, a few, several. These also can indicate how many they can be used as adjectives. Which one might specify that could be a color, it could be some other type of specification. What kind might indicate a group or description. Again, most words that describe nouns are going to fall in this category of descriptors. There's another really small, very precise part of adjectives called articles. A, an, and the are the three in the English language. And they're really more interesting to know as you start to learn other languages. For example, in Spanish, French, Italian, the Latinate languages, there are different types of articles, not just a and an, which are indefinite. They don't really tell you which one it is, and the, which tells you it's more specific. But they can get into singular and plural in those other languages, masculine and feminine in those other languages. So there's a lot more to them, but they are considered adjectives because, if nothing else, the a versus the tells you it's just generally a random, perhaps, example of that term, and the tells you it's a more specific example of that term. It's a car versus the car. There's a very different understanding there. Note, an is used if the word begins with a vowel sound, not only if the first letter is a vowel. Since we pronounce the word herb when referring to oregano, tarragon, parsley, cilantro, those kind of green things that grow that we use to give flavor to food, because we pronounce it herb, not herb, we would say an herb, just like an orange. So it's not whether it starts with a vowel, it's about starting with a vowel sound. There's also proper adjectives. These are adjectives describing words formed from a proper noun and are capitalized the same. So if you capitalize the word France, then anytime you use the word French, whether it's dressing, bread, fries, doesn't matter. If you capitalize France, you capitalize French. If you capitalize America, then you always capitalize American. There's no deviation from that. There's also things called predicate adjectives. Depending on what you've studied so far, we've looked at these a little bit as subject complements. These follow a linking verb and they modify the subject, like such as Mr. Orth is crazy. Crazy is the predicate, it's after the verb, but it describes the subject, Mr. Orth. So that's another type of adjective. There's also some adjective suffixes, which we've looked at a little bit here as you did some of this earlier on. So some of these that you see in the list here, these are some suffixes that can be used to create adjectives. They have meanings as well, but when we see these endings, we know these words are going to be describing words. If you have an FUL ending to a word, that's a describing word now. Whether it's fanciful, eventful, it's what is eventful, what is fanciful. So if something is capable or susceptible or teachable, what or who is capable, teachable, or susceptible? So when we use these endings, we know we're looking at an adjective. All right, moving on to adverbs. Again, they're also descriptor adverbs. These indicate how, when, and where. Just kind of general adjective or adverb words. Words like immediately or soon. Those can indicate when. There's also intensifiers. This is actually a really important distinction. To what extent? Well, the most common intensifier adverb is very. And it's really important we notice that because the V-E-R-Y version of very, there's obviously very that has to V-A-R-Y with an A that is similar to variety or differences. Very, V-E-R-Y, anytime you see that, it's going to be an adverb, just is. And if you see any word that can be replaced or used as a synonym for very, like quite, or excessively, or extraordinarily, or especially, those are always going to be intensifiers. They're going to intensify or add detail to, add intensity to another word that's already being described. Some adverb suffixes. This also can be really important to notice. There aren't as many of them, but the most important one is the first, ly. When ly is added to a word, it almost, not always, but almost always is going to make it an adverb. Again, not when a word just ends in ly, but when ly is added to as a suffix to a word, it's almost always an adverb. There are a few exceptions, but not many. So you see immediately and excessively on this page. Those are examples of ly suffixes. So how do we use these? First, we're going to find our verb and our subject first, so we can understand the sentence. It's also important because, as you recall from adjectives and adverbs in the notes, we have to actually look for nouns and pronouns. We have to look for verbs and adjectives and those other things to understand the sentence, and therefore we know what it's going to be once we find those things. We're going to find every and any describing word in the sentence, just any of them. We're going to use underlining for this since we usually highlight our verbs. And then you're going to next try to figure out which word is being modified, which word is adding detail, and which word is clear because of those describing words. If we were on our own paper, we'd simply draw an arrow to it. We'll type in arrows to indicate that that's where it's going, that's what it's describing. Remember, adjectives describe nouns and pronouns. So you found a describing word, and you feel like that describing word is adding detail to a noun or a pronoun. Well, then that describing word is an adjective. Whereas you found a describing word that's pointing to a verb or an adjective or another adverb, like an ly word or very. Those are going to be adverbs. So we'll definitely need to do some practice with this tomorrow to help make more sense of it. Today, again, we're just gathering information into our notes. If you can't find the word modified, if you know it's one of these words, you see it on a list, for example, you know it's a describing word, but you can't figure out which word is being modified. That can happen, and it doesn't mean that you're lost. It doesn't mean you're confused. It just means sometimes it's hard to locate. In the circumstances where you can't find the word that's being modified, can't draw an arrow to anything, then ask which question is being answered by that word. If that word is describing a who or a what, then it's going to be an adjective. If that word is describing where, when, why, or how, it's probably going to be an adverb. Don't use this question option unless you truly can't find the word that it's pointing to. All right, first example. Silly superstitions sneak into common conversations. Perhaps you've seen the sentence from before. I'm kind of fond of it. Got some alliteration there, almost a tongue twister type look, but it also has the parts of speech we're discussing today. So what's the verb? The verb is sneak. So if I ask who or what sneaks, the answer is going to be my simple subject. Superstitions. So superstitions is the simple subject. Now I'm going to look for any describing words. We already know superstitions and sneak are the subject and verb, so those can't be describing words. What other options do we have? Well, does anything describe superstitions? Does anything describe sneak? Does anything, what else is there? Well, silly describes superstitions. We already said superstitions is a subject, and by definition, subjects are nouns or pronouns. We don't need to figure out which one superstitions is. We know it's a subject. Therefore, silly has to be an adjective because it's describing a subject. What other describing words do you see? Right, common. Now, common is describing the conversations. Conversations, again, I-O-N words, are going to be nouns. So what is conversation is a thing. Again, only things can be plural or singular. That S on the end of conversations also is a hint that it's a noun. If common is describing that, then common is an adjective also describing a noun. Second example, slippery snakes slither sneakily into quite quiet quilts. Yes, get over it. I know it's kind of irritating. I like my tongue twisters sometimes. So again, we find our action verb. Is there an action verb? Yep, slither is going to be our verb. Who slithers? Snakes. So that's our verb and our subject. All right, looking for describing words. Does anything describe the snakes? Slippery describes snakes. So since snakes, the subject is a noun, slippery is going to be an adjective. Sneakily describes how they slither. Again, notice that ly, it's like sneaky with an ly added to it. So again, that's going to be an adverb. What is it describing? It's telling you about the verb, slither. What else do we have? Well, quiet describes quilts. Okay, so quilts is a noun. It's a thing, it's plural. So quiet describing it makes quiet an adjective describing the noun quilts. Quite describes quiet. And again, quite is a synonym for very. So anytime you see very, V-E-R-Y, we know it's an adverb. How do we know? Well, it's describing the quilts. It's not quite quilts. It's quite quiet. It's describing the quiet. It's not describing the quilts. It's really important we look for that, what precise word we think it's pointing to. All right, that is the work for today in the notes. We'll come back to it tomorrow and do the guided practice together.